A man who worked closely with Supreme Court Justice Robert H. Jackson comes to Jamestown today. Ambassador John Dullaby interrogate the man later prosecuted by Jackson during the Luxembourg trial. He was working for the Procter & Gamble when he got his draft letter. Ironically, he was born in Luxembourg, the country where the Nazi officials were held before trial. His knowledge of the German language made him an ideal interrogator. He says he worked with Jackson to figure out the Nazi party system and the personalities of the accused Dullaby, along with four others, Hotel as the prisoners.
We were worried about them wanting to commit suicide. There were no door locks, no doorknobs, no screws, bolts, anything they could use.
Dullaby would interrogate the prisoners and then send their responses to Jackson in Paris. He was named ambassador to Luxembourg by President Reagan. He's now 83 years old.
A well-known local attorney gets a special honor for his community service. Tonight, the Chautauqua Leadership Network gives a local attorney a special honor.
Greg Peterson, the recipient of the 2001 Leadership Award.
The award's given to the individual or organization whose activities during the past year have done the most to further the mission of the Chautauqua Leadership Network. Greg Peterson's involved with the Resource Center, Jamestown Jammers, and the Robert H. Jackson Center.
I'm honored not only to receive the award individually, but more importantly to, as a representative of those particular organizations of which I'm proud to be a part of.
The network began in 1993 to promote leadership in Chautauqua County. It provides leadership training and education about the county to nearly 200 people since its inception. A man with first-hand knowledge of the Nuremberg Nazi trials speaks to the public today at the Jackson Center in Jamestown. Father Moritz Fuchs served as the bodyguard of Supreme Court Justice Robert H. Jackson during the trials. He spoke about his relationship with Jackson, calling him a kind, sociable, and confident man. Fuchs says he'll never forget sitting in the courtroom and listening to the atrocities of the Nazi Party. He says it's important that we remember the significance of the Holocaust.
Unless we get to know the facts of what history has experienced, then we have an incomplete picture of what's going on. So it does take some effort, and I'm very pleased to hear what they're doing down here in Jamestown.
Fuchs took some time after his speech to sign autographs and share some personal memories. He was interviewed in detail Wednesday for the center's arc. A local high school student donates her talent to the Robert H. Jackson Center in Jamestown. 17-year-old Chelsea Monroe Castle is a student at Jamestown High School. As part of her independent study project, she worked with local artist Dave Poulin. Her assignment was to create a piece of art reflecting local history. After visiting a former concentration camp, Chelsea decided to create a statue of Holocaust survivor. It was modeled after a family friend, Dina Jacobson, who now resides in Elmira.
And I chose Dina because I had wanted to do someone with character. And Dina has so much character in her face, and so she really made a perfect subject.
I hope that they'll realize that these things really do happen. Chelsea hopes that it reminds them also that it should never happen again. And let's hope it never happens again, but we know that in smaller instances it has happened since the end of World War II.
Chelsea says she spent several months working on the statue and is glad her work will be enjoyed by the community.
A Japanese American who refused to join a World War II internment camp is coming to Jamestown to honor Justice Robert Jackson. 83-year-old Fred Korematsu is traveling across the country to pay his respects to Justice Jackson Thursday. Korematsu was at the center of a legal battle in 1944 over the racial profiling of Japanese Americans who were sent to internment camps during World War II. The case made it all the way to the Supreme Court, where Justice Jackson wrote the dissenting opinion in Korematsu's favor. Officials at the center say his visit will shed some light on the case.
This is one of the first we've had of what happened on the court in some of Justice Jackson's decisions on the court. And we're very fortunate that Mr. Korematsu is still alive and is willing to come. And we're fortunate that this documentary has been done on his life.
Korematsu will speak at the Chautauqua Institution Thursday at 2 p.m. He will tour the Jackson Center Friday afternoon. When we come back, James Reed will preside over the forecast. Alicia, now Taylor has 1 year left at Geneseo College, then she plans on joining the Peace Corps for 2 years. And still ahead tonight on Time Warner, Cable 8 News at 10. He made his way to Chautauqua County from California just to pay tribute to Justice Robert Jackson. His incredible story coming up. And a little later in the broadcast, the Chautauqua County Humane Society puts its stamp of approval on a brand new project. We'll be right back.
Cable 8 News is brought to you in part by Tim Hortons.
The subject of a famous dissenting legal opinion written more than 50 years ago by then Justice Robert H. Jackson travels across the country to pay his respects and share his remarkable story. Speaking today at the Chautauqua Institution, 83-year-old Fred Korematsu in town from California to discuss what he calls a violation of constitutional law by the U.S. Army. Korematsu is at the center of a legal battle in 1944 over the racial profiling of Japanese Americans who were sent to internment camps during World War II. Korematsu refused to go and was eventually arrested. His case made it all the way to the Supreme Court, where Justice Jackson wrote the dissenting opinion in Korematsu's favor. He has been awarded the Presidential Medal of Freedom for his courage in seeking justice.
Back, everyone. A man who worked side by side with Supreme Court Justice Robert H. Jackson stops in Jamestown today. After graduating from Harvard Law School, Murray Gartner worked as a law clerk for Justice Jackson. He began in February 1945, only a few months before the Nuremberg trials got underway. He helped Jackson research international law. Before heading to Germany, Gartner says Jackson was told most of the evidence had been collected and the trial would take about 2 to 3 months. Yet, when Jackson arrived, he quickly discovered that wasn't true, and the trial ran for about a year. As for Gartner, a promise prevented him from accompanying Jackson to Nuremberg.
He said, "Oh, no." He said, "I made a promise to you that you could have your vacation at the end of the term, so I'm not going to go back on my word." So instead of going to London, I had a vacation.
Gartner is the first of 4 clerks set to visit Justice Jackson's hometown this week. All worked for Jackson during his 13-year tenure on the Supreme Court. On Wednesday morning, the clerks will hold a roundtable discussion entitled Reflections on Justice, Robert H. Jackson. For April 11th to talk about what can be done to ease the problem. Experts will present their ideas on how to improve the local economy. The mayor of Troy, New York's among the presenters. Troy was once labeled the most distressed city in America by the Wall Street Journal. The public's invited to attend and bring their questions and concerns.
Well, I think the things that get bandied about the most are the high tax rates in the city of Jamestown, the amount of untaxed property in the city, the basic financial woes of the city.
The event's organizers hope the data presented will help the community make better decisions. Again, the forum slated for April 11th at 7 p.m. The county executive, Mayor Sam Teresi, and members of the legislature are expected to attend. And speaking of the Jackson Center, the facility gets a boost from Bush Industries today. This kiosk was donated by the company and now displays pictures of Jackson for the community to enjoy. Bush Industries usually designs machines like this one for retail stores. With a simple touch, the public can learn more about the Supreme Court Justice from Jamestown who presided over the Nuremberg trials.
For the history part and educationally for the children and for all of us, as a matter of fact, to learn more about this brilliant man who is from Jamestown, New York. So it's an opportunity for the young and the middle-aged and the older people too.
We're a very visually oriented society these days, and anything we can do to make children kind of tune into history in a very exciting fashion, that's our goal. And these kiosks fit the bill very nicely for that.
Bush Industries expects to donate another kiosk to the Jackson Center that will be even more interactive.
Werner von Rosenstiel served as an investigator and interpreter during the Nuremberg trials. Today, he speaks to residents of Justice Jackson's hometown about his encounters with Jackson and Hitler. Time Warner Cable 8's Jessica Stegan joins us now live in the newsroom with the story. Jessica.
Mark von Rosenstiel has quite a story to tell. He was born and raised in Germany and even served in Hitler's army before switching sides to become an American citizen and lawyer. Von Rosenstiel came to the U.S. to study law. He was awarded a scholarship to study at the University of Cincinnati. After living in a free society, von Rosenstiel started to question his life in Germany. When he returned home, von Rosenstiel made sure to keep quiet about his American loyalties.
And what I learned enormously from American newspapers, because the newspapers reported many of the things that I'd never read in the German paper. And I became somewhat suspicious about what had gone on in Germany.
When von Rosenstiel came back to America to marry his college girlfriend, he was interrogated by a judicial committee because he was labeled an enemy alien. He was eventually drafted into the United States Army and brought to Nuremberg to act as an investigator and translator. He worked side by side with Justice Jackson, whom he now calls his hero. Mark, as a member of the German aristocracy, von Rosenstiel saw Hitler speak several times. He said that Germans know about Hitler's plan to expand in Europe, but they did applaud his promises of economic growth. Reporting live from the newsroom, Jessica Stegan, Cable 8 News. Welcome back, everyone. The head of the U.S. judicial system honors the city of Jamestown with a visit to the Robert H. Jackson Center in May. Chief Justice William Rehnquist will lead the Jackson Center dedication scheduled for May 16th. Rehnquist served as Supreme Court Justice Robert H. Jackson's law clerk from 1952 to 1953. He's expected to discuss his experiences and how Jackson's legacy continues to impact government today. Those at the center say Rehnquist offers yet another insight into the man who served as chief prosecutor of the Nuremberg trials. And they add his arrival will put Jamestown in the national spotlight.
For us, very, very exciting. And he does have very warm remembrances of Justice Jackson, and clearly one of the reasons he's coming here is to show some sense of a payback to Justice Jackson. And we're the beneficiaries. Our community is the beneficiaries of that.
Rehnquist has led the U.S. Supreme Court for more than 3 decades. He's ruled on controversial issues, including abortion.
Jackson Center in Jamestown today honor a local couple who helped restore the historic facility. Jackson Center Executive Director Raleigh Kidder officially designates the building's recently restored formal parlor, the Stanley and Sarita Reeks room. The prominent local couple funded the entire restoration of the room that will now bear their name. In addition to being a close personal friend of Justice Jackson, Stanley Weeks served as the mayor of Jamestown in the 1950s and still practices law in the area. Weeks says he's happy to donate to the center.
Keeping track of this, and
I think the whole complex here is a very tangible tribute to the memory of one of the nation's greatest jurists and our own friend, Bob Jackson.
Without the Weeks contribution, we wouldn't have this room. We wanted this old parlor and drawing room of the Kent Mansion to be restored to the elegance that I'm sure it had in days past. It may be more elegant than it was even when the Kents were here.
Welcome back, everyone. 3 former law clerks of Justice Robert H. Jackson are making a stop in Chautauqua County to share their memories of their former boss. The 3 served Jackson in the 1950s and are taking part in a roundtable discussion entitled Reflections on Justice Robert H. Jackson. But before tomorrow's program, center officials sit down with former Jackson law clerk George Niebank for its archives. Niebank served as Jackson's law clerk from 1950 to 1952. He was raised in Jamestown. His father was also a close friend of Jackson. Niebank earned his law degree from the University of Buffalo in 1950. In 1952, co-clerk William H. Rehnquist joined Kneebank in Justice Jackson's chambers. Kneebank says Justice Jackson often spoke of his time in Jamestown, but would not discuss the merits of a particular case with his law clerks.
This may be hard to understand, but or hard to comprehend, but there really wasn't that much interaction between us and the justice in regard to pending cases and cases that were being written up. He did his thing and we did ours.
Serving as commissioner of the U.S. Court of Military Appeals, Kneebank moved to Chicago to join the law department of Santa Fe Industries. Meantime, former Jackson law clerk Donald Cronson also sits down with Jackson Center officials for the archives. Cronson served as an intelligence officer with the U.S. Army and as a part of the Tokyo headquarters that prosecuted minor war criminals before joining Jackson as a law clerk from 52 to 53. Cronson says Jackson often said he learned from law, or about law that is, from the mistakes he made in Jamestown. Cronson says although Jackson considered his work in the Nuremberg Nazi war trials the greatest achievement of his life, he did not make many references to them. Cronson adds the trials gave Jackson a great appreciation of elementary human rights under the law.
On the Rehnquist, the confirmation you just talked about.
In this connection, I think he did point out the fact that that was the thing that was the really big difference with Nazi Germany, the fact that they trampled on all of the procedural rights that were involved, and that was one of the things which made him so convinced of the very great importance of procedural rights.
Cronson adds Jackson applied these lessons in the landmark 1954 case of Brown versus the Board of Education that eventually led to the end of segregation. The Jackson Clerk Roundtable will be held at the Lene Hall at the Chautauqua Institution, 10:30 tomorrow morning. This Wednesday, October 8th, 2003. I'm Mark Ashgarian. We're going to begin tonight with the past meeting the present as three former law clerks of Jamestown area native and former Supreme Court Justice Robert H. Jackson converge on Chautauqua County to share their memories and honor their former boss. Time Warner Cable 8's Casey Bortnick has more on the reflections of Justice Robert H. Jackson.
Donald Cronson, George Kneebank, and Barrett Prettyman. All three men were chosen as young lawyers to serve as law clerks for Justice Robert H. Jackson in the 1950s. All three say they'll never forget the experience.
I had an enormous amount of respect and, as it turned out, affection for the man. Respect for what he'd done and the way he did things. It was a magnificent experience.
And he was also a very practical man. The experience that he had here in Jamestown as a lawyer, he knew all aspects of the law. He knew how to practice. He knew how things went.
During Jackson's 13 years on the Supreme Court, he employed 11 clerks for an average period of 2 years to examine court petitions and condense them for his review. Both Cronson and Prettyman served Jackson during the landmark case, Brown versus the Board of Education. Although Jackson's opinion is often cited in the ruling that eventually led to the end of segregation, Cronson says Jackson was not comfortable overturning Plessy versus Ferguson.
He had a lot of misgivings about it. First of all, he really wasn't all that persuaded that Plessy was wrong. And secondly, something you find very often in Jackson's positions, a great reluctance to overrule constitutional precedent.
Jackson's former law clerks say the justice referenced several landmark cases during his time on the Supreme Court, but rarely spoke of his work in the Nuremberg Nazi war trials. Both Kneebank and Cronson say they believe the military tribunal sharpened Jackson's skills and shaped his opinions on individual liberties.
He had a very keen sense of injustice, perhaps sharpened by his Nuremberg experience. And that was a combination that I don't think you see in anybody on the court today.
Although the three former Jackson clerks went on to have distinguished careers in law, each say their time with Jackson had a lasting effect, both professionally and personally.
He was a great man in my life and a model for me. He was a Renaissance man, a man of many facets, and Lord knows I miss the writing You just don't see that kind of writing today.
And he imbued me, I believe, with more or less his view of the law as the fabric which holds society together.
Reporting from the Chautauqua Institution, Casey Bortnick, Cable 8 News.
All right, excellent. Thank you, Casey. Now, following the program, each law clerk participated in a question and answer lunch program. Jackson Center officials will sit down with Prettyman tomorrow morning for the center's archives.
Author shares his insight on the Nuremberg Nazi war trials with a large crowd at the Robert H. Jackson Center. Joseph Persico speaks Monday about the book on the Nazi tribunals. Nuremberg, Infamy on Trial is one of many books written by Persico, who had served as speechwriter for former New York State Governor and Vice President Nelson Rockefeller. Persico says he's always been fascinated by the Nuremberg trials and the work of Justice Jackson.
Unforgettable to me, it was a photograph, and I'd read many books. They were essentially legal tomes, and I wanted to write a narrative that would read like a story. So that's why I chose that subject.
Persico's book was used for the TNT movie Nuremberg, starring Alec Baldwin as Jackson.
Former talk show host will be in town later this month, sitting on the other side of the microphone. Talk show legend Phil Donahue will be at the Robert H. Jackson Center Wednesday, August 23rd from 4 to 6 in the Carl Capra Auditorium. Tickets are now on sale at $10 a person on a first-come, first-served basis. Tickets must be purchased in advance at the Jackson Center, or you can call to purchase as well. Jackson Center Chair Greg Peterson will interview Donahue about a 1977 taped interview with Albert Speer, the last surviving Nazi official tried at Nuremberg by Jackson. Donahue is also expected to address the crowd as well. As a reporter at the Nuremberg trial, speaks in Jamestown, Ernest Michel stops by the Robert H. Jackson Center to discuss his 6-month stint reporting for a German news agency during the trials and the struggles he faced trying to maintain his objectivity in his reporting. As for his views on Germany now, Michel says he does not hate the country, claiming there is too much hate in the world already, and he does not want to be a part of it, arguing the new world in which we live also includes a new Germany. Jamestown plays host to a seminar focused on providing area residents with a more effective government. The seminar geared toward sharing services with the premise that there's too much government in New York State and that there are more public sector than private sector jobs in the state than the economy can handle. Featured speaker Kenneth Bond of the State Bar Association, who spoke in part of the program enacted by the state providing grants to local municipalities who take advantage of reducing the size of government.
And it's really a question of whether or not the state, in cooperation with local governments, can address this problem head-on their own initiative. And it's a difficult issue. There are public sector jobs that are at stake. There are lots of interests to keep the status quo. There's an interest to make sure that people stay in New York State and don't move to other jurisdictions where it's less expensive.
But in the 7 counties of the project I'm working on, 7 rural western New York counties, we have 217 governments for 640,000 people. That averages out to a government for every 3,000 people. In this day and age in which we live, that's way too much government from our perspective.
Thomas also serves as director of the SUNY Fredonia Center for Regional Development and Government, focusing on shared services.
Following agreements reached in its host to a film series tonight. In fact, for the next 6 Thursday nights, the center is running parts of a PBS series, Eyes on the Prize. The effort is part of a build-up to the center's Brown versus Board of Education anniversary celebration April 28th and 29th. The series focuses on the development of the civil rights movement and Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. Center officials describe the event as unique to the community.
As far as we know, we're the only place in the state that's building an educational program that lasts this long around this case. It was Robert H. Jackson's last major case, Brown versus Board. He wanted to be a part of the unanimous decision in that case, and 3 months later he died of a heart attack. So in a sense, it may be his last legacy.
The event runs 7 to 9 each Thursday night and is open to the public, free of charge.
Cable 8 News.
Good evening, everyone. Thanks for watching Time Warner Cable 8 News on this Monday, January 26th, 2004. I'm Mark Ashgarian. We begin tonight with an Oscar award-winning movie producer making a stop in Jamestown today to share his experiences filming Nazi concentration camps during World War II. Time Warner Cable 8's Casey Bortnick has more on how the work of Bud Schulberg during the Nuremberg war trials brought the horrors of the Holocaust to a world stage.
One of the nation's motion pictures pioneers, 89-year-old Bud Schulberg, makes an appearance at the Robert H. Jackson Center to speak publicly for the first time about the films he produced for the Nuremberg war trials in the 1940s. Compiled from captured German newsreel and propaganda films, the Nazi plan was introduced as evidence by Justice Jackson.
He mentioned the evidence that he felt would make their case conclusive, and also he said you will be seeing film and photographs put into evidence. It was the first trial ever to use film, and was probably the most important trial maybe of all time.
During World War II, Schulberg served in the U.S. Navy, where he joined John Ford's documentary unit. After the war, he was in charge of photographic evidence for the military tribunal. From there, his unit sifted through burned film and encountered uncooperative Russian authorities to piece together the film. Although he was never in direct contact with Jackson, Schulberg says his requests were specific.
But the message was that this was the first time that film was ever going to be used, and we better be damn sure we had it legally right, that there were no tricks in it, nothing that the defense lawyers could object to.
Since Hitler's notorious SS division had their own film unit and editing crew, Schulberg says the documentation of the atrocities at the Nazi concentration camps was both compelling and disturbing in a way that could not be put into words.
They show the uprising, they show the killings, they show the shooting, and then they show the dishes where the poor emaciated bodies are being buried. And they have a cameraman, a German cameraman, right down deep in the pit. I mean, women with infants were being thrown down past the camera, and the thought of that guy down there just doing this as his job was something that is hard to ever erase from your mind.
Schulberg says after the film was shown, several of the Nazi defendants acknowledged their fate.
When the lights came on, Hans Frank, the Gauleiter for Poland, his head was on the table. And he had absolutely passed out. He was unconscious. I think as he was watching that, and knowing that we were all watching it, I really think he could see himself on the gallows.
Although Schulberg went on to receive national recognition, he described the importance of his Nuremberg work as the highlight of his career.
It's a subject that has stayed with me all my life. For the Justice Jackson's staff to have the vision to use film, in a way that anybody looking at could not deny.
In Jamestown, Casey Bortnick, Cable 8 News.
All right, thank you, Casey. Now, Schulberg praises Justice Jackson for pushing the international community for the Nuremberg trials. He says Jackson's doctrine of fairness, even in the face of evil, still lives on today. Sir speaks about politics and race. Those stories top our look at people in the news when we return in just a moment. Stay with us. People in the news, the Robert H. Jackson Center plays host this afternoon to local author and SUNY Fredonia professor Kevin McMahon. McMahon invited to discuss his book entitled Reconsidering Roosevelt on Race, How the Presidency Paved the Road to Brown. Officials say despite what some believe about FDR and race, the book argues Roosevelt's administration played a key role in the Supreme Court's commitment to racial equality, culminating in its landmark Brown versus Board of Education decision.
That if you look at FDR's appointments, and perhaps more importantly, the activities of his Justice Department, his stamp is clear on the work of the Supreme Court beginning in 1944 and culminating in the Brown decision 10 years later.
Today's event is just one of many leading up to the April 28th and 29th appearance of the Brown sisters to the Jackson Center. Welcome back, everyone. A Brown University professor and author lectures at the Robert H. Jackson Center this afternoon about a U.S. Supreme Court landmark decision. Professor James Patterson speaks today about the court's Brown versus the Board of Education case, calling it a civil rights milestone with a troubled legacy. As part of his lecture, Patterson argues Justice Jackson was on the fence about the decision, hoping the legislative branch would make the call. Patterson goes on to say there are still large gaps between blacks and whites in education, including a major drop in the number of black students attending white schools in the South since 1988. Patterson concludes desegregation took a long time to be operative in the South, with no great effect in improving the gaps.
Now, for all these reasons, I would argue that research into the sources of these gaps and action to narrow them, but I'm not sure what that would be, are imperative if racial desegregation of the schools is to move ahead in the future.
Now, today's event is just one of many leading up to the April 28th visit of the Brown sisters to Jamestown. Next week's events recognizing the 50th anniversary of the Brown versus the Board of Education Supreme Court decision. Next Wednesday morning, the Robert H. Jackson Center will play host to 4 of Jackson's law clerks. Later that evening, a dinner at Chautauqua Institution. Former Attorney General under the Kennedy administration, Nicholas Katzenbach, who was partly responsible for carrying out the decision, will be the keynote speaker. Then on Thursday, the Brown sisters will be on hand speaking at Chautauqua as well.
We have the most diversified program, we think, in the United States around this event. And we hope that the community, people in the community, can take at least a piece of it, a part of it, and come and participate with us.
Kidder adds the winners of a statewide essay contest will also be
of youngsters on hand celebrating the 3rd annual Law Day at the Jackson Center today. As part of the observance, area students put on a short play called What Daddy Says, written by Matt Kraft. The play focuses on segregation and centers around a black man from Mississippi and his desire to register to vote. Judge Joseph Gerasi also on hand, reaffirming the court's dedication to protecting the freedoms of America. Meantime, Jackson Center officials credit the kids for putting on a tremendous performance.
Some of the things that you saw today in our play and everything that we're going to be doing for Law Day, we're going to try to use for a jury from the American Bar Association. We think we should be recognized on a national level for the work that was done here.
By my presentation and the other presentations here, that they now that we know that we have courts on a national basis that are dedicated to protect the freedoms of America.
A landmark Supreme Court decision with one of Jackson's former law clerks. Jackson Center President Greg Peterson and law professor John Barrett sit down with E. Barrett Prettyman for the Center Archives this afternoon. Prettyman served Justice Jackson during the landmark Supreme Court decision of Brown versus the Board of Education. The case that eventually led to the end of segregation is the focus of a 3-day event highlighting the case. Prettyman will join 3 other Jackson clerks at tomorrow morning's roundtable discussion. Prettyman says Justice Jackson had misgivings about the effect the decision would have on the South, but not the overall importance of the ruling.
It was something that even the man in the street could understand, that if you take children and separate them forcibly, solely because of their race, that you are saying that the races are unequal, and guess who is inferior? And in that day and age, 1954, you couldn't do that any longer.
Now, former Attorney General under the Kennedy administration, Nicholas Katzenbach, who was partly responsible for carrying out the decision, will be the keynote speaker. Then on Thursday, the Brown sisters.
Scholars, politicians, and civil rights leaders say it is the most significant legal decision in the last 150 years. Brown versus the Board of Education of Topeka, Kansas.
Today, the little girl who was part of the suit, now a grown woman, was at the Chautauqua Institution, telling a new generation how important this case has been. 7 News reporter Linda White has the story.
my playmates wanted to know, well, why don't you go to school with us?
She's a person many of us only read about in textbooks and magazines. But Thursday morning, Linda Brown Thompson told her story to these school kids at the Chautauqua Institution. Here's Linda as a little girl with her dad, Oliver Brown, who filed the lawsuit, Brown versus Board of Education, Topeka, Kansas.
Because of that decision, students are sitting next to another in the classroom. They're participating in their extracurricular activities. They're doing everything together now.
By the time the Brown case reached the Supreme Court, 5 public school segregation cases were included in the suit.
Brown versus Board became more than just a school desegregation, but in fact an opportunity to apply that principle in several areas.
After reading about them in textbooks, more than 1,000 students heard what the Brown sisters had to say, met them in person, and formed new opinions about what the Brown case means to the nation.
It was really emotional, just like to kind of understand, like, wow, you know, to think, you know, we couldn't all be together in the same school and that it can be separated. It's kind of weird to comprehend.
It's like a privilege and an honor that somebody did something to help us and benefit us.
At the Chautauqua Institution, Linda White, 7 News.
The Board of Education, 2 sisters who bear the case's name reflect on the importance of the ruling. Time Warner Cable 8's Casey Bortnick has more.
On May 17th at 12:52 p.m. in 1954, the U.S. Supreme Court overturned a previous ruling that allowed lawful racial segregation for nearly 60 years. The case was named for an African-American Kansas man, Oliver Brown, who tried to enroll his 7-year-old daughter Linda into an all-white school in Topeka. 50 years later, in front of more than 1,000 students, Linda and her sister Cheryl recall their father's place in history.
I didn't understand what was happening then, but it was clear that Brown versus the Board of Education was a necessary victory. It might have been a little flame, but it served to set off a mighty flame.
Separate was never intended to be equal, because the way our country espoused democracy and the way it practiced it with respect to people of color were 2 different things.
The sisters say their father was one of 13 recruited by the NAACP in the fall of 1950 to sue the Topeka Board of Education. The case was then filed in district court under the name of the only male on the list of plaintiffs, Oliver Brown. Cheryl says although the Supreme Court ruling was far from a cure to the country's racial division, it did expose it.
It placed the issue of race squarely on the national agenda. We were no longer living in the United States of denial. We couldn't pretend anymore that everything was all right on the racial front.
Both the Brown sisters say, despite the sacrifices of their father and hundreds of other African-American families in the segregated America of the 1950s, many inner-city schools remain economically segregated today, leaving the fight for racial equality unfinished.
The problem lies within the physical makeup of the inner city. The housing patterns are still causing us today to find predominantly all Black and Hispanic schools in certain areas.
Linda says the impact of the ruling is seen in today's young Black professionals who grew up believing they had a choice. But both sisters say it's up to all Americans to finish the work started 50 years ago in Topeka, Kansas.
So I am challenging you all to take the risk to get to know the person on the other side of that skin color, because that's the only way we're going to be able to finish the unfinished business of Brown v. Board.
Reporting from the Chautauqua Institution, Casey Bortnick, Time Warner Cable 8 News.
All right, excellent. Thank you, Casey. Now, today's event is part of a 4-month celebration program sponsored by the Robert H. Jackson Center in Jamestown. Well, the pages of history books come to life today as the Brown sisters spoke to more than 1,000 students from across Western New York. Children from as far away as Rochester join local students from Southwestern, Clymer, Randolph, and others to hear Linda and Cheryl Brown tell the story of Brown versus Board, seen through the eyes of a child. Some of the students were interested to hear if the sisters had white friends as they were growing up, while others were more excited to learn about what Linda and Cheryl were feeling while the case was going on. The kids in attendance say the Brown sisters are right when they say the controversy, prejudice, and misunderstandings so prevalent in the 1950s still exist in many classrooms around the nation today.
Between the two ultimately produces the Civil War.
Even though like it's against the law and stuff, there's a lot of racial discrimination against people, and I see it every day. It's horrible, and people should just know there's like people just like us.
Nobody can understand it until they're actually involved in it, and I think this is a chance for most of them to actually, get as close as they can to actually learn about the past and how important it is to everybody.
Now, both girls say they were hoping to meet the Brown sisters after the program. The girls add they and their classmates were honored to be given the chance to attend today's event.
Center is set to play host to a key figure in the preparation of the Nuremberg trial. Former prosecutor Jack Robbins will be in town Monday. During his career, Robbins served as a legal aide and then as prosecutor in a medical case during the Nuremberg trials. As a result, he framed a 4-count indictment against 23 Nazi doctors accused of organizing and taking part in war crimes and prisoner experiments. As a result, he devised what's still known today as informed consent. Officials say Robbins will provide a new take on one of the oldest and darkest chapters in history.
We hope, of course, that people like Mr. Robbins, in coming to the Jackson Center, sort of relives this part of history, because, you know, things tend to go around again and people don't learn from the lessons of history. And this was one of the important developments that came out of Nuremberg. And
Nuremberg trial's subsequent proceedings reflects on his experience today at the Robert H. Jackson Center. Robbins worked in Germany for 2 years as a legal assistant to Chief Prosecutor General Telford Taylor, in addition to his duties as lead prosecutor in what's known as the doctors' cases. Robbins tells those in attendance his job was to prosecute numerous Nazi doctors who were responsible for performing lethal experiments on Jewish prisoners.
Inmates were forced by camp doctors into tanks of ice water or kept naked outdoors at below freezing temperatures for many hours. Indeed, the true object of many of these experiments was not how to rescue or how to cure, but how to destroy and how to kill.
As a result of his work at Nuremberg, the policy we know today as informed consent came to be. Robbins says he followed precedents set by Jackson throughout the trials. Robbins was accompanied today by his wife Hilda, who served as a dietitian at Nuremberg. So that is, there's the spotlight with area residents. That story after the break. An Emmy award-winning film producer makes a stop at the Robert H. Jackson Center today to share his work with a group of elementary students. 90-year-old Robert Beckwith entertains more than 150 local students with his Emmy award-winning film Follow the North Star. The movie takes place in the Civil War era and focuses on an effort to reunite a family torn apart by slavery. Beckwith, who makes his summer home at the Chautauqua Institution, has been showing the film to school-aged children in the Florida area since his retirement 20 years ago. The Syracuse native says he loves working with kids.
I must have had, over the years, 20,000 letters from kids, easily. And I can't answer them because we don't have time. But when I look at these kids, and if I can just impress a couple of them.
Beckwith also worked as the director of program sales for ABC before heading up RKO Pictures. He also worked for a large advertising company in New York, where he was able to cross paths with none other than Lucille Ball. Well, the best groups of all times. That story after the break.
And also,
former drummer for the Fab Four makes a stop in Jamestown today. Pete Best and his band have been playing at different venues around the area. Today, Best sat down with members of the media to reminisce about his life prior to joining the group. He began with the Beatles in 1960, left in '62, and stayed in showbiz until 1968 to help raise his family. Following a Beatles convention, Best says he formed his own band in 1988 and has been playing around the world ever since. Best speaks of a different John Lennon than the quiet and hard-imaged man the rest of the world saw.
Hard-imaged, won't let anyone get too close to him. But I saw the other side of John because we spent many, many nights propping the bars up in Hamburg. Okay. Yes, we propped them up good and proper. And, you know, I found that, you know, there was a very tender and a very loving side of John, which the world never saw at that time. And you take those two entities, and you put it together, and that made the complete man for me. So John was my favorite.
Now, Best arrived in the States on June 30th, and after a gig in Allegheny County, it's back to England on the 17th. Trials take center stage at the Chautauqua Institution today. Richard Sonnenfeld visits Chautauqua today to share his memories of Nazi Germany, the Nuremberg trials, and Robert H. Jackson. Sonnenfeld served as chief interpreter for the U.S. prosecution at the trials. Born in Berlin, Sonnenfeld remembers growing up as a German Jew in a world where children were being taught to believe their country was cheated out of victory in World War I. His parents moved the family to the U.S. soon after, and he became a citizen at age 20. He still remembers when Adolf Hitler came into power and changed the Germany many people know. He recalls the day Hitler's Minister of Propaganda made an eerily accurate prophecy.
He is one of the... We sit in the Reichstag, the German parliament, to arm ourselves with the weapons of democracy from its own arsenal in order to destroy it. We shall go down in history as the greatest statesman of all time, or the greatest criminals. Now, how about that for foresight?
In addition to his many other achievements, Sonnenfeld served as executive vice president of NBC from 1979 to 1982. He is also an accomplished author and discussed his new biography and first book, Surviving the Nazi. Center plays host to an author of a book about the late Supreme Court Justice. Author Jeff Hockett speaks at the center today. Hockett has written a book entitled New Deal Justice. In his book, he compares Jackson to colleagues Hugo Black and Felix Frankfurter. He spoke today about Justice Jackson and executive power, lessons for a post-9/11 America. And our courtesy of retired advertising executive Terry Jonathas. The posters are mainly of Paris, dealing with the liberation of France. Organizers say it exemplifies the Jackson World War II connection.
In retrospect, Jackson probably looked back on his career and said, you know, the one thing I did do dealt not maybe with winning the war, but winning the peace, which dealt with people coming to terms with the tremendous crimes that had occurred in Europe during the war, and the concentration camps, and the death camps, and the slave labor camps, and all the rest of the things that went on, the terrible things.
Kidder adds the collection will be a permanent part of the Jackson Center.
Jackson Center in Jamestown today for a first-hand account of the Holocaust. The students hear a presentation by award-winning author Jerry Spinelli, who wrote the book Milkweed. The students have read the book, which tells the story of the Holocaust through the eyes of a 12-year-old orphan living on the streets in Poland. Kids also listened to a speech by Holocaust survivor Dr. Helen Fagan. Center officials say the speakers offer perspective.
And said, when I stood at the courtroom and I was asked
to hear Dr. Fagan or Spinelli give details of real stories that happened to real people, it's a very effective, moving experience, especially when you're talking about the Holocaust.
The county and state winners of the Jackson Center's essay contest on Spinelli's book also attended today's event. Still, more than 650 students from Chautauqua County packed the Robert H. Jackson Center in Jamestown today for a first-hand account of the Holocaust. The students hear a presentation by award-winning author Jerry Spinelli, who wrote the book Milkweed. The students have read the book, which tells the story of the Holocaust through the eyes of a 12-year-old orphan living on the streets in Poland. Kids also listened to a speech by Holocaust survivor Dr. Helen Fagan. Center officials say the speakers offer perspective.
and said, when I stood at the courtroom and I was asked
to hear Dr. Fagan or Jerry Spinelli give details of real stories that happened to real people, it's a very effective, moving experience, especially when you're talking about the Holocaust.
The county and state winners of the Jackson Center's essay contest on Spinelli's book also attended today's event. Town will commemorate a landmark court decision that spurred the civil rights movement. The Jackson Center announces a 6-part series of events in honor of the 50th anniversary of Brown versus Board 2. Jackson Center President Greg Peterson says the event series will look beyond the original groundbreaking 1954 case. The second Brown versus Board ruling laid the groundwork for the civil rights movement of the 1960s. Peterson says the case led to major cultural changes.
So I think it is important to stop and reflect on those decisions in the Supreme Court, what impact it has had and continues to have. And we're blessed at the Jackson Center because we are focused in on this events-based education.
The first event is slated for April 24th and will be hosted by former state Supreme Court Judge Joseph Gerasi.
Kathy Young makes a stop in Jamestown today to deliver some very exciting news for a local center. Young announces she secured $150,000 in state grant funding for renovations to the Robert H. Jackson Center's auditorium. A strong Jackson Center advocate, Young says she was thrilled to obtain the funding, which will be used for air conditioning, electrical work, and other upgrades. The Olean Republican says the center is a vital resource because it serves to educate and inform people about the world's most challenging and timely problems while also honoring Justice Jackson, a Jamestown native. Young says it's important to preserve and expand on Jackson's legacy.
That legacy is defense of individual liberties. It's being fair and providing justice.
10-year-old daughter Linda into an all-white elementary school in Topeka in the fall of 1950. Brown versus the Board of Education 2 was argued in April of 1955. The court ruled segregation be ended with all but deliberate speed.
It was not designed to achieve racial balance. It was designed to end legally imposed segregation of the races in the public schools. It was not intended to be a panacea for all of the terrible problems that we did have then, and to a great extent we may still have today.
I think it is easy to say, well, they should have done more, but it's difficult to put your finger on exactly what they should have done that they didn't do. I'm not saying they necessarily did the right thing. I'm just saying this was a difficult problem.
Supreme Court Justice Robert H. Jackson died before the second ruling. Prettyman said Jackson saw flaws in the first decision. Now, today's discussion is part of a 6-part series of events commemorating the anniversary. That center welcomes a former reporter who witnessed the Nuremberg war trials firsthand. Norbert Ehrenfreud spoke at the center today, sharing his memories of the trials and Chief American Prosecutor Robert H. Jackson. The reporter turned lawyer and California Superior Court judge recalls Jackson as an imposing figure who always appeared elegant and polished in court. Ehrenfreud said nowadays when most people recall the Nuremberg trials, it's associated with the Holocaust and crimes against humanity. He says, however, Jackson saw it more as an opportunity to deter people from war.
You want to send this message that if you commit war crimes, if you wage aggressive war or conspire to wage aggressive war, if you commit crimes against humanity, then you could be brought before a court, an international court of law, and face serious consequences. That's the message he wanted to send to them.
Jackson Center officials say the judge's presence and insight offers a new perspective into Jackson. State University announced a new educational agreement today. Jackson Center President Greg Peterson signs the Memorandum of Understanding along with Bowling Green reps Dr. Doug Neckers and Dr. Heinz Bowman. Under the agreement, Bowling Green students will have the unique opportunity to study and conduct research at the Jackson Center. Both sides believe the agreement will help promote the center as an archival resource for the study of Jackson's influence, while providing Bowling Green students the opportunity to get a first-hand look at the Jamestown native's life and career.
Master's students in history and political science and German and Russian and other languages will have a chance to use the archives and develop the archival procedures and help with finding out just what it is that Jackson knew and wrote and said and did and led the world to in his era.
We've always prided ourselves as these folks have come to the Jackson Center to interview them, to make sure our programming is filmed. But one of the things we probably have not done yet, and we're kind of too young to do it, is the catalog. What is it that just occurred here? Let's try to put all of this into historical perspective.
Private funding will be sought to provide undergraduate internships at the Center for Bowling Green students. Dusher shares his most accomplished work with the local community. That story after the break. And also, the filmmaker shows one of his most famous motion pictures at the Robert H. Jackson Center today. 91-year-old film producer Aaron Beckwith presents his film Follow the North Star to a group of students and the general public today. The movie takes place during the Civil War era and centers around a white boy's journey south to free an enslaved boy and reunite him with his mother, who previously fled north. Beckwith made the film more than 40 years ago when color was first invented. A native Western New Yorker, Beckwith says the film's message is still relevant today.
I just can't stop hoping for peace. And kids appreciate it too. And to see that people their age are willing to fight for freedom and do whatever they can in their own little ways makes me happy.
The film will be shown again Wednesday morning, July 22nd.
Today, after 24 years, U.S. Supreme Court Justice Sandra Day O'Connor is stepping down. O'Connor was appointed to the Supreme Court by President Ronald Reagan in 1981. In addition to being a prominent national figure, O'Connor visited Jamestown in 1996 and the Chautauqua Institution last August. Robert H. Jackson Law Center President Greg Peterson says O'Connor had early input into the creation of the Jackson Center. Peterson describes O'Connor as a warm person who always speaks highly of Justice Jackson.
And there she talked from the amphitheater stage about the wonderful words of Justice Jackson. So from the Jackson Center, we count Justice Sandra Day O'Connor as a friend, and she stayed in touch directly and through the Bratton family.
Peterson also credits O'Connor with helping to bring Chief Justice William Rehnquist to Jamestown to officially dedicate the Jackson Center. And a Jamestown man is awarded the highest honor for bravery by the French government. On August 16, 1944, Hospital Corpsman George Lawn was serving on a minesweeper in southern France. During the invasion, the ship hit an underwater mine, destroying the vessel. Lawn was credited with saving the lives of 16 men. Lawn is one of only a handful of Americans to receive this honor, including President Ronald Reagan, Colin Powell, and General Norman Schwarzkopf. Well, still ahead tonight on top.
Those at the Robert H. Jackson Center are getting a real-life and sobering history lesson as part of a two-day event honoring author Lois Lowry, who will speak there tomorrow. Jamestown resident Jim Sorg on hand tonight. Sorg speaks of when he and his mother went to visit his grandmother in Norway, just as the Nazi invasion took place. As a result, he couldn't leave the country and thus grew up there. He says he saw quite a bit.
With the uniform marching down the streets. I saw my first killing when I was 12 years old. A friend of mine and I were going to a movie. And we were walking down the street and we saw these two German patrolmen come towards us. And all of a sudden they made a left-hand turn and they went into this alley. And they were walking down this alley for some reason. And it was a dead end. I believe it was a dead end rally. And exactly when we got to that alley, the entrance to the alley, we saw 4 Norwegian underground people jump out of a side door, jumped over the top of them, and were stabbing these guys. They went down, and of course the Norwegians, they went back in the room and or back through the door, disappeared.
The center also honors student contest winners from Chautauqua County and around the state for essays they wrote about Lowry's book, Number the Stars. They received certificates of appreciation, a copy of her book, and a $500 savings bond. Chance to hear an internationally known author speak about her novel on the Holocaust. Cable 8's Jade Boyce joins us from the newsroom with more. Jade.
Author Lois Lowry visits Jamestown today to discuss her Newbery Award-winning novel about the Holocaust.
And I tell you all of that story because it means so much to me, and it shows so well, I think, how children are the ones who can heal wounds that go very deep.
More than 1,000 students listened to Lowry today as she speaks about her novel, Number the Stars. Based on true events, Lowry says the story is one kids can identify with.
I was affected by World War II because my father was in the Pacific. My friend Annalisa, who had grown up in Copenhagen, was affected because her entire country was occupied by the Nazis. She told me what had happened there, and it really is such a wonderful story. And there are not enough wonderful stories coming out of a terrible time.
All the students present today have read Lowry's novel and say having a chance to hear the author talk allowed them to better understand the book.
She explained stuff that wasn't in the book, and it kind of connected quite a bit and let you get a full picture of what was going on.
Lois was able to give the background information on why she chose this book to write about, having a lifelong friend from Denmark who told her about what life was like in the 40s, and it really did give a good background for all the kids.
The Robert H. Jackson Center, who hosted the event, says Lowry's book is a great way to get kids interested in history and the events of World War II.
This was designed for 6th graders, and it's told through the story of somebody that they could relate to. And to be able to feel, sense history, to note the compassion and passion of the narrator throughout the book is one which certainly appeals to that grade group and leaves an impression.
In celebration of Law Day, organizers say the opportunity for the kids to participate in the event helped them better understand how the law works, rather than just learning about it in their textbooks.
The printed page is fine, but I think that they learned a little more. And judging from their questions that they asked after the trial, they picked up on some of the key points.
I think that by having an actual jury selection, going through that process, although it was an abbreviated process, was great for the kids.
More than 200 kids from 6 local schools participated in a mock trial set up by the Jackson Center. Goshgarian, Friday, November 3rd. Here's what's happening. Trail, U.S. Senator Hillary Clinton making a stop at the Robert H. Jackson Center Friday afternoon as part of her public campaign schedule in these last few days before the election. The former First Lady, along with U.S. Congressman Brian Higgins, State Assemblyman Bill Parment, and County Sheriff Joe Girassi address a large crowd of Democrats at the rally. Healthcare, energy costs, and educational costs were among some of the topics Clinton addressed. Mrs. Clinton stressed the importance of coming out to vote if people wanted to see change in their government.
Years, which is just a blink of the eye. I really believe that if we have a good turnout, Democrats will win. The Republicans are counting on turning out people who don't want change, people who are satisfied with what's going on in the country, what's happening in Iraq. I don't think that reflects the majority of New Yorkers or Americans.
Clinton also bashed President Bush, saying he doesn't act like he feels any accountability for his actions. She added that Iraq, as well as reducing our dependence on oil, are among her top priorities. And local Democrats show their support for Hillary Clinton, saying she is a candidate who has the ability to help out the local area.
When we have projects that are important that are going on, you know, she has a face with a name, and when you develop these relationships, it just is more helpful in terms of trying to, you know, build up our economy here in Western New York. So.
Meantime, U.S. Congressman Brian Higgins also addressing the crowd at the Jackson Center Friday afternoon, showing his support for Clinton, as well as campaigning for his own re-election. At this point in the race, Higgins says he, quote, feels great.
Let me tell you something. Good government's the best political strategy. You do your job, you deliver for the community, you're accessible, and the politics will take care of itself. And I'm not asking people to vote for me because I'm a Democrat. I'm asking people to vote for me because I'm a highly effective congressman for this community.